If you are anything like I am, an exciting fourth quarter of a football game has often raised profound philosophical questions. Whenever a team executes a brilliant and exciting 2-minute offense as the end of the game is approaching, I am prompted to wonder, why couldn't they move the ball like that in the first quarter? I guess there's something about deadlines that creates the aura of emergency, and it motivates people to do things that they ordinarily wouldn't be willing or able to do. There's an analogy here. The progressive left has an agenda for the entire globe, and their ordinary ground game is the climate change strategy. They've been at it for decades and have been content to gain 3 yards at a carry, with a number of successive first downs to their credit. But the COVID-19 scare has been their 2-minute offense. They have gotten more ground covered in the last several weeks than they've been able to do over the last several decades on the climate change front. Their goal is power. They want to be able to manage, using the words of Deuteronomy, you're going out and coming in. No one denies that true emergencies can always happen and should be treated like true emergencies. And in a true emergency, an alien invasion, a giant meteor shower, a smaller version of Noah's flood, nobody would have any objection to governmental authorities responding accordingly. But unfortunately, there are some ostensible emergencies that can look like a true emergency. And we should remember the truth that there's nothing quite so permanent as a temporary government program. We would do well to remember the warnings about governmental emergency powers left to us by Friedrich Hayek. The conditions under which such emergency powers may be granted without creating the danger that they will be retained when the absolute necessity has passed are among the most difficult and important points a constitution must decide on. Emergencies have always been the pretext on which the safeguards of individual liberty have been eroded, and once they are suspended, it is not difficult for anyone who has assumed such emergency powers to see to it that the emergency will persist. Indeed, if all needs felt by important groups that can be satisfied only by the exercise of dictatorial powers constitute an emergency, every situation is an emergency situation. That's from Law, Legislation, and Liberty, Volume 3, Chapter 17. Now that last comment is worth pondering. We need to take it to heart. Are there any important constituencies out there that believe, for example, that we are living in a constant state of emergency because of the threat of climate change? And is there any possibility at all of a Green getting elected to high office? Or someone completely beholden to the Greens? Many Christians are entirely too naive about the goals of the Greens, thinking that they are motivated by a simple and innocent desire to keep woodland bunnies free and happy. But these people are actually watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside. Our problem is that, in the name of fighting the coronavirus, we have ceded to the government the authority of emergency powers that were granted on the basis of a dubious scientific approach to computer modeling, which is the same approach that is used by the climate change alarmists. We may soon discover that states of emergency are far easier to get into than they are to get out of. C.S. Lewis once passed a Narnian proverb onto us, one that we would do well to remember. Easily in, but not easily out, as the lobster said in the lobster pot. Welcome to Man Rampant, the COVID Diaries. It's good to be with you all. I'm glad to welcome Peter Hitchens, the noted Peter Hitchens, or as his Twitter tag has it, the hated Peter Hitchens. It's good to have you with us. Good evening to you. Good morning here.
Well, good morning to you.
Welcome.
We'll stick to morning, shall we?
Yeah,
it's morning in America.
We'll pretend that it's morning. And Peter is a journalist with The Mail on Sunday, not just any Mail on Sunday, but The Mail on Sunday, and has been attracting a lot of attention in the UK for his relentless pursuit of the issues surrounding the coronavirus outbreak in the UK and the implications there, and I thought we would spend our time talking about it. I wanted to set this up, Peter, in this way, and then invite you to comment on your take on the relative seriousness. There seems to me there are three tiers to this crisis. One is the virus itself, the people who are sick and afflicted and the people who have died. The second would be the economic and financial repercussions of our approach to this, shutting everything down. And then the third would be the issue of civil liberties. What's happening to our civil liberties in this? How would you agree with that stacking of the issues, and how serious would you rate each one of them?
Well, I think the first problem is and must be to work out just how serious and unique this outbreak is. And I'm afraid at the moment I'm a bit stuck because there doesn't seem to me to be all that much reliable information, but there does seem to be an awful lot of panic. And I have been most impressed by the contribution of Professor John Ioannidis of Stanford University in California, who's drawn attention to the way in which mortality rates have been attributed to the COVID-19 virus, which are frankly unsustainable by intelligent statistical analysis. And yet these, despite Professor Ioannidis' extremely articulate points, well made and very easily available, people still continue to act as if it was an immensely virulent and dangerous virus which killed huge numbers of those who are actually infected by it, when I don't think this is really true. Obviously, people are killed by it, and it's tragic when they are, but we have to make some estimation as to whether this is really a repeat of the 1918 influenza crisis, or whether it's, or indeed of the SARS problems that happened earlier in this century, or whether it's something less significant. But I'm constantly confused by the way in which so many people seem to have an interest in making out that it is worse than it appears to be.
Are you referring to the fact that dying with the COVID virus is not the same thing as dying of it?
Well, I think that's a crucial part of it. We've in the Spectator of London, Professor John Lee, a noted British pathologist, has pointed out that the way in which these deaths are recorded is possibly, how should I put this, misleading. And of course, here is the difficulty. I've heard only this week of a 93-year-old person who died, who was 93, who contracted the coronavirus and very shortly afterwards developed pneumonia and died. But she was 93. And people who are 93 are vulnerable to all kinds of things. And so one has to say, what did she actually die of? Was it the coronavirus that killed her, or was it the fact that she was 93 and she would almost certainly have died of something else if it hadn't been that? This is a difficult problem. People immediately raise it, say, oh, well, so you don't care about old people dying, which is ridiculous because I am old. Or they say, oh, well, it doesn't really matter whether they die next week or later, which again, of course, I care very much about preventing unnecessary death or people dying earlier than they need to. But it is a question of proportion that we're dealing with here. We are taking the most extraordinary measures in many of the major countries of the world to deal with this. Are they justified by the facts? Are they justified by the threat which it poses? And to examine this, one needs to make, well, not calculations, but one needs to make judgments, at least, about what is more important than what is more important, what is less important, what would conceivably justify the level of action being taken. And here you have, in this country, two things. Let's just say the United Kingdom. You have an extraordinary attack by the government on its own economy, in which we are now largely a service economy, and almost all the services are shut down. You walk around my home city of Oxford, everything is shut except a few food stores and one or two takeaways, which somehow mysteriously have escaped the ban. And that's more or less it. Some trains and buses still run, but they're largely empty. It's the small shops, the newspaper shops, which are allowed to stay open, are increasingly closing up because there are no customers, because we're not allowed out on the streets. And
right.
I look at this, and this morning we learned that 36,000 employees of of our national airline, British Airways, have been laid off. And 950,000 people have applied for some sort of unemployment pay, known as universal credit in this country. That's 950,000, which in our population is an enormous number. These are signs which in normal times would be taken as really serious indications of a big economic problem. And these are the ones which have so far been published. I believe that there are many, many other businesses which are suffering grievously in lost sales and lost income. And people say, oh, well, so you're only worried about money. And I said, well, no, we all live and move and have our being in God, but we also live and move and have our being in an economy. To say, I love my life and the social services and the school system and everything else, but I don't care about the economy is like saying, I love my house, but I don't care about the roof or the foundations or the walls. If there's no economy, these things can't be sustained. Neither by private income or by public taxation. It simply can't be done. And I don't think, probably since 1931, I don't think the British economy has been so gravely damaged. And on this occasion, it's being damaged at a time when things are bad enough already because of the stock market crash and the fall of the pound sterling. It's being attacked by its own government. Now, whatever the government in 1931 did, it didn't actually set out to attack our own economy in the middle of an economic crash. It's the most bizarre behavior. I'm troubled because I know too much about politicians and I have a very low opinion of them. So I can't comfort myself with the belief that they must know what they're doing because I don't think they do.
Right. So I'm reminded of a comment that the great Thomas Sowell once made, who said that conservatives think in terms of trade-offs and progressives think in terms of solutions. Progressives tend to say, here's the problem, we need to solve it. And they don't ever look at the price tag. We just need to act now. We're burning daylight, lives are being lost, we need to act. And they don't ask whether or not we're going to pay the price with more lives lost later on because of what we have done.
Well, it's not just that. It's worse than that. I look at all this and I say, what is the evidence that a mass economic shutdown and the confinement of the entire population to their homes is actually going to make anything better? How do we know this will save a single life? If you look at all the countries which have undergone outbreaks of COVID-19, from China through South Korea to Singapore to Hong Kong to Japan, and then the European countries, particularly Spain, Italy and France, and the Scandinavian countries, including Sweden, you will see no pattern whatever which shows that any particular action is necessarily followed by any result. Interestingly, for instance, both Hong Kong and Singapore largely escaped any serious tangle with the disease, but they took quite different measures. So trying to make out that the fact that they acted swiftly and all the rest of it is all very well, but the fact is there is nothing to say that these measures are actually on. If you examine more than one country, the measures being taken are the ones which it is right to take. The example we seem to have bizarrely decided to follow is that of the People's Republic of China, a censored police state, which reaches naturally for the tools of oppression to deal with almost any problem, and indeed locked people up and prevented them from traveling, and in general was wholly and almost savagely totalitarian about it. Now, why should we do that? How can we rely, for instance, on the figures from such a country? There's no independent press there. There's no independent academy. Nobody even knows that what they're telling us is correct. And then in any case, how do we know this isn't a simple post hoc ergo propter hoc? It didn't happen in Japan the same way. They haven't shut down at all. They're not suffering particularly badly. South Korea, everybody goes on about how much they tested, but testing doesn't frighten a disease to death. The thing simply didn't spread all that much. So the other explanations might be in order. And then when you look at at Sweden versus the other Scandinavian countries, and people are making claims, but the fact is that as yet there isn't a gigantic divergence between Sweden and the Netherlands, which have decided not to go for a full shutdown, and other European countries which have. On the contrary, in fact, the Italy and France, and Spain, which have gone for shutdowns, are still experiencing very high levels, they say, of COVID-19. And then there is this problem of did they die with it or of it, which which keeps on coming up. What are we actually saying here? Are we moving deaths from one column to another, or are we actually finding out that people died of COVID-19? I don't know the answer to this, and I'm not sure how anyone could find out, because, of course, no post-mortems are being done under the circumstances. It would be extremely risky. So the attribution of cause of death is very difficult. But you can say with certainty that people died with coronavirus, and people are maybe making too much of that when they hear the news.
So you're basically, if I'm understanding you rightly, you're flipping it. When the people who are fomenting the panic are saying it's lives versus you going out for a night of fine dining, or lives versus you conducting your weekend recreations as normal.
Yes.
And if we say no, it's we're wrecking the economy, so it's lives versus lives. You're saying it might even be the other way around. The wrecked economy is really going to be devastating.
Shall I give you
my
my parable for this occasion? A man goes to the doctor with a very bad case of chickenpox. And the doctor says, "This is a very bad case of chickenpox. I haven't seen a case of chickenpox as bad as this for years. I'll tell you what, there's a new treatment for chickenpox, which has been tried in China, has been very successful." And the patient said, "Oh, what's that?" And the doctor says, "Well, I have to cut off your right leg." So the patient says, "Well, hang on, I'm not sure about that." The doctor says, No, honestly, this is so serious that it's the only thing I can do. I have to cut off your right leg." So the doctor cuts off the patient's right leg. And soon afterwards, the patient recovers from chickenpox. And the doctor says, "Well, there you see, it's worked. And your chickenpox has been cured." And the patient says, "Well, yes, but I've only got one leg." And the doctor says, "Well, this is the price you have to pay." And this is more or less British government policy. They look at the problem. They say something must be done. Somebody else says this is something. And they do it. And the relevance of it to the problem seems to me to be at the very, very least limited. What can one do in face of this sort of thing? I have serious doubts about it. By simply raising these doubts, I'm accused of seeking the deaths of the old and of being callous, and all kinds of other rude and unpleasant things are said to me. One journalist on one newspaper in a big country says, "Hang on a minute, shouldn't we have a debate about this?" And what do I get? Slime. The thing which really amazes me about this in all the advanced countries of the world is this. There are supposed to be, in civil society and in free countries, particularly those with adversarial parliamentary systems such as ours, there are supposed to be things called oppositions, which scrutinize the government policy and make sure that the executive doesn't just get away with doing what it wants to do without having been made to explain itself properly. Well, in our case, the parliamentary opposition had nothing whatever to say and folded up, both on the government's policy on the shutdown of the country and also the government's policy of making a grave attack on civil liberties. Nothing at all. The judiciary, nothing. All the human rights crowd, who are normally shouting all the time at any infringements or anything, they said nothing. Most of the media, with one or two honourable exceptions, said nothing. Public opinion said nothing. And so all the organs which are supposed to protect modern societies from making mistakes just folded up or melted away. And there I was standing there, finding myself ludicrously, virtually the only voice in an entire country saying, "Actually, hang on a minute. Could we wait a minute? Just a second. Before you do that, could we just have a look at it? It may not be right." And it's an extraordinary experience. I may be completely wrong. I could be but nonetheless, I just had a duty to insist on a debate, even if I am wrong.
So, and we over here, we saw how lonely you were over there. So we thought we'd join you and give you a little friendly company.
Well, thank you. I have had the absolute support, of course, of Mrs. Hitchens, who's done a lot of transcribing and other work keeping this going. And this was vital at what to me was a turning point. And we have a thing called the Supreme Court. It isn't really, but it does have some quite intelligent judges on it. And one of those former Supreme Court judges, Jonathan Sumption, did, I think with some courage, come out publicly against this on roughly the same grounds as me, that it's disproportionate. And this has been an enormous boost to me, because I make no pretense to be anything other than a jobbing scribbler. I have no expertise. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an epidemiologist, though I have often quoted people who are in this, who seem to me to have sensible things to say. But ultimately, people despise reporters for popular newspapers, so that's a burden I have to bear, and I don't mind. But to have the support, or at least to have standing beside me saying the same thing, this man who is one of the most brilliant legal minds of our time, and also a distinguished historian, interestingly enough, of the 100 Years' War, is encouraging and makes me feel less alone. And I think there is, after this past week, a growing sense among the media, at least, that things are maybe not as clear-cut as they were. The government's being attacked at the moment for its failure to do testing, which is a side issue, but it's a sign, I think, of a media impatience with the government, which doesn't really seem to know very clearly what it's doing. So it may be that this opposition has to some extent worked.
I don't know the situation on the ground there in the UK as well as I do here, and I don't believe that there was a conspiracy in the United States where some master fiend or archvillain said the Russian collusion story didn't work against Trump, released the virus. So
it's like an episode
of
The Simpsons, isn't it? That wonderful one where cats become a national danger.
So, but I also believe that 10 minutes into the coronavirus panic, political opportunists saw their opportunity, and here the one great juggernaut that the anti-Trump people were facing was the economy. The economy was going great guns, and they put a bullet through the head of that economy. So this is why bad news sells. There's the normal journalistic, if it bleeds, it leads. There's that tendency. But there's also the fact that Twitter and Facebook will actually censor or shut down people for reporting promising research developments, so the quinine as a treatment, or things like that.
Well, okay, it may be so. My experience of politics is that getting anyone to engage in any sort of conspiracy is like herding cats. It's extraordinarily difficult to do. I think conspiracies do happen in politics, as I often say. In Britain, they're generally called lunch, where people get together confidentially over a table covered in expensive food and wine, and decide to fix something privately without letting people know they're working in concert. But that happens. But I think most political failure is explained by stupidity and by the low quality of the people involved. I think probably in our parliament now you have to pass an examination to establish that you're not intelligent before you're allowed in. It certainly seems that way when you listen to them, and it doesn't surprise me at all when they mess things up. And I think our civil service has greatly declined in quality in recent years as well. It's partly a result of the 1960s educational revolution, part of the Cultural Revolution. People are now taught what to think rather than how to think, and so faced with any kind of really serious dilemma, they just rush to see what the mob is thinking, and they join with the mob. My great good fortune and ill fortune is that I was educated before then, so I don't join the mob. So it means I get an awful lot of abuse. But it is, at
least you have the comfort of knowing what's going on.
Yes. I mean, my late brother used to say that he worked in Fleet Street, so he didn't have to rely on the newspapers to find out what was happening. And I've always thought that was one of the cleverest things he ever said, because I work on newspapers as well. I know exactly what he means. It's not what goes into the papers is not by any means a complete picture of events, or necessarily always the right one. So it is useful to know, but it's very hard when you have a suspicion that the government is going seriously wrong on your own to try and grab hold of anybody's ear and say, look, can we do something about this? And here's the problem we have. But one has to do it if one can. I said, people say, well, what if you're wrong? I said, well, I know. I knew the moment I decided to speak out about this, I knew, of course, I might be wrong. Everybody can be wrong. And I could be wrong about this. But and I knew that. And I knew the risk. If I am wrong, then it's the end of me. And yet I still took the risk. I think from that, people can judge how seriously I take it.
Right. So I want to talk a little bit about Imperial College and the initial model that spooked everybody. Because I don't know if you noticed, but there was a the daily press briefing at the White House. I think it was 2 days ago. Now there was a really interesting pivot, and I just wanted your take on this. So the initial projection was 500,000 deaths in the UK,
Yes.
and up to 2.2 million deaths in the United States. The gent who ran that study just recently, a few weeks ago, downgraded it to like under 20,000 deaths.
That's right.
In the UK, and I understand he's done it again.
Well, no, there was a problem which arose, and I made a mistake about this, which I've corrected and apologized for. It has to be clear about. Another group of researchers at Imperial College came up with a paper suggesting it could be as low as 5,700. I wrongly attributed this to the same outfit as Neil Ferguson, and it isn't. Okay. So, frankly, it's an error of tiny proportions, because the difference between under 20,000 and 5,700, when your previous figure was 500,000, doesn't seem to me to be huge. But I'm a great believer in immediately and clearly acknowledging and publicly acknowledging errors when I've made them. So I would like to be clear on that.
Okay, so it was a different group out of the same
college, and they've since, I think, themselves revised it. As I say, what difference it makes, I don't know. If you drop your prediction from 500,000 to 20,000 on the basis that the government has done what you advised it to do, then it seems to me, how can we possibly be dealing with solid fact here? It must be guesswork.
Right. So a couple days ago, maybe 3 days ago now, the Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx were basically trying to explain computer modeling to reporters, and they said basically it's a GIGO principle: garbage in, garbage out.
Indeed.
The assumption you put assumptions into your model, and lo and behold, that's what comes out. And so they were explaining this, and they were explaining the limitations of the Imperial College model, Dr. Birx was, and sort of said, and here's the problem. Well, the next day, President Trump, and this was after the Neil Ferguson revised his estimate down to 20,000, yes, which seems like a big oops. Well, then after that, President Trump took the podium and took credit for saving the lives of 2.2 million people. Mm. All right. So,
well, he's always been a very modest man, as we know.
Yes. Well, it looks to me like if they're going to run you out of town, you get out in front and make it look like a parade.
Well, of course.
Right.
But I think Ronald Reagan is the only United States president who ever actually saved any lives, and that is when he was a lifesaver.
When Trump does that, basically, it seems to me that when the Imperial College estimate is discredited and revised by the man who ran the study.
Well, let's be as fair as we possibly can to Professor Ferguson. His argument is this, and he would say if he were here, and I think this should be put because I believe in fairness, that what he's saying is that thanks to the measures having been taken by the British government, which he had more or less advised, the danger has dropped so considerably that 480,000 fewer people will now die. That is what he says. I say, how can you possibly know? And what I'm basically doubting is the quality of the knowledge which he claims to have. And I think that there was a very funny journalist in Britain a few years ago called Keith Waterhouse, who posited the idea that there was somewhere in the British government a Department of National Guesswork, which provided most of the estimates ever made by the state about anything. And it was so easy to get journalists to swallow any figure you like, provided it was delivered by a man with a PhD and a university. And they would say, "Oh, right, millions will die, or the economy will recover, or this railway line will only cost £40 billion to build," or whatever it is, and people would believe it. But it's guesswork, and how could it be anything other than guesswork anyway? But after 2 days of raggedly enforced shutdown, Professor Ferguson says, "Okay, right, we're on course down to 20,000. Some of us are entitled to say actually, if it moves that easily, it can't have been that solid.
Right. So I understand that Ferguson would say that it's because the British government acted swiftly that we saved all those lives.
That's more or less the line.
The timing doesn't add up
It's
at
not
all.
just that. You see, there are other scientists. There's a group at Oxford who've come out with the contrary report, which says that probably huge numbers of people have already had coronavirus in Britain, and there's a great amount of herd immunity. And there are others who have criticised the London Daily Telegraph last Saturday ran a story which I repeatedly tweeted a photograph of, which showed that there were other scientists in the field who very much dispute Professor Ferguson's ability to predict. And the Imperial group is notoriously connected with an episode which I was witness to 19 years ago, in 2001, when we had a great outbreak of what we call foot and mouth disease in Britain, which is largely a cattle disease, also affects sheep. And
the mad cow thing.
Imperial College decided that the best thing to do was to have a mass slaughter of healthy animals. It was horrible to watch. I went down to the West Country to watch it. There were farmers in tears and great pyres of animal corpses burning through the night, and a terrible stink. And there's, I think, a very, very widespread belief now amongst those involved in that this was not a correct policy and did not do any good. But this was very much influenced by Imperial. And they are not universally beloved. And of course, the other person who one has to consult in this is the professor of microbiological medicine, former professor of microbiological medicine at the University of Mainz in Germany, Professor Sucrit Bhakti, who has actually written to the Chancellor of Germany saying that these shutdown policies are totally wrong, and given a brilliant, cool, cogent, logical reasoning as to why it should not be done. And he's, I would say, rather more of an expert in the matter than Professor Ferguson, or certainly at least as qualified to speak out on it. But the British government haven't consulted him and haven't paid any attention to anything he said. So this problem with experts is that they differ. And then if you want to rely on experts to tell you what to do, you'll always be stuck, because there'll always be another expert who says, actually, no, that's wrong. Ultimately, if you sought political power, what you sought was the power to decide and to choose. You have to choose between the experts. I think the British government have chosen wrong.
Okay. And you see your accounting for it is generally poor education and stupidity across the board. You don't leave room for malice?
Oh, no, I don't think so. I think that they really are children running around trying to work out what to do. I imagine it's terrible for them. I feel some pity for them, because I don't think they know what to do. I don't think they know how to do it. And I don't think they have either the character or the intellect for the job which they've sought so hard to get. Which is a pity, but there it is. It's the nature of the way in which people are selected for political office. And I was joking when I said you had to pass an examination to establish you were stupid. But it isn't entirely untrue. The selection of parliamentary candidates for winnable seats in my country is one which must be designed to winnow out anybody of independent mind, particularly.
Mm-hmm. So, when returning to the president's news conference, where he took credit for saving 2.2 million lives, it seems to me, whether you use the word discredited or revised, as soon as that study that was spooking everybody is downgraded, Trump is a master showman. He likes cameras, he likes talking, he likes getting out in front of it. He likes saying all other leaders are total disasters when it comes to handling viruses. Look at me go. And if you see over here, I don't know that this is the case in the UK, but there's a very clear political delineation on responses to the virus and responses to the cure for the virus here. So generally, conservative voices are those saying, what are you doing, what are you doing, what are you doing? And the progressive left is largely behind the draconian shutdowns, right? And it seems to me that Trump has pivoted such that he took their propaganda point, how dire this was, and is using it as a feather in his cap on all the lives he saved.
Well, hasn't
And they
he, in the
can't.
course of this, moved from being skeptical about the dangers of the virus to being more or less part of the crowd saying, panic, panic, panic?
Yes, he was riding the brake early on. He was riding the brake, and then 2 days ago he flipped.
Yeah.
But he flipped after it looked like the hellish projections were not going to happen.
Yeah.
Right? So he flipped, and he did that in order to maximize the terrible plight he saved us from. Once the salvation looked like it was in the bag.
Well, yes, of course, you have an election going on, don't you, for your chief magistrate? So that must influence it. We don't have that at the moment. We're probably free of elections unless the government collapses. We're free of elections for another 4 or 5 years. So it isn't electoral politics going on here at all.
It's not a political season for you.
The supposedly opposition Labour Party and the other opposition party, the amusingly entitled Liberal Democrats, have shown absolutely no sign whatever of opposition. It's quite noticeable, a great enthusiasm among many people on the left for this. I think it appeals to something profoundly authoritarian in them. That they like to see this exercise of power for the common good. The health of the people is the highest law.
You see unanimity of opinion across the establishment, across political parties.
Although I have acquired some allies in this matter as it's gone on, some I'm sure were there at the start. I think, to begin with, there were probably fewer of them than there are now. I think a lot of conservatives were loyal to the Conservative Party. And people I like and generally respect have fallen for it. But far worse than that has been the sort of invasion of the body snatchers behavior of people who I believe to be intelligent too, entirely and utterly taken in by panic. And not it's not. I don't mind people believing the government's ideas about what's going on after serious consideration. What I do mind is them sort of believing it out of a kind of mass fear that really and truly, if they met me out in the street and I got within 7 feet of them, they might be in danger of being given plague by me. I think they genuinely think that.
That's why we're doing this interview this way.
Come on, you know, if we were in the same room, we would get to within a good deal less than 7 feet of each other. But I abide by all this stuff because I know how upset people are. I don't. It is very, the belief in it, the trusting belief in it, is very widespread. And I think to myself two things. I think, good heavens, if only the Soviet Union had a population as willing to believe government propaganda as this lot, it would still exist. Which, of course, they didn't. I mean, nobody believed anything they were told in the USSR. Everybody knew it was all lies, but they carried on behaving as if they thought it was true because that was the only way to get their children into college. But there was no doubt a huge amount of skepticism. Everybody believes it here, and it's like living in a country where everybody else has a different religion from you. They wear different things, and they celebrate different feast days. And the only thing to do is to go along with it. Not you don't have to believe it, but you're polite to it. So if people think that it's a good idea for me to stay 7 feet away from them, then I will. I even went round a supermarket the other day with a scarf wrapped around my face like a bandit. Because there was this general belief that this might make things safer. And I thank the checkout clerks at supermarkets because I know that many of them believe that they are at some considerable risk by doing this job. So they need to be thanked. If they believe that and they've done it, then it's an act of bravery to go. So I think that's right. But I don't myself believe that they are at risk. And we also have this thing about how tonight, at I think 8 o'clock, we're all supposed to go out into our front porches and applaud the National Health Service, or our NHS, as it's now called. Well, no, I'm as keen as the next man, and probably keener on praising doctors and nurses who risk infection and even death as they do. by going and working, and I'm very keen on supporting them as much as possible. But a collective act of applause, encouraged by the government, smacks to me rather of the old Eastern European countries I used to visit and live in, and I don't like it, and I'm not going to do it.
It looks kind of like a North Korean missile parade.
Let's not get. No one's going to be arrested for not doing it, but or indeed you won't. No, you won't lose your job for not doing it. But what it's just there's something to me. It's something terribly conformist about it, and I think applause is spontaneous or it's nothing. And I think applause, which is organised and which anybody feels under any pressure at all to take part in, is wrong. I just peel away from it. If people want to do it, I won't go and rain on their parade. But on the other hand, if anybody tries to put pressure on me to do it, I'll resist it.
After this is all over, let's say the crisis is past, everything, we're 3 months down the road or whatever it is.
This rate could be 2 years. There's no end to it in sight.
Well, it seems to me that if it's the wreckage of economically, the trade-off is going to be unpayable. The price would be unpayable.
It can't be paid.
Right. So if at some point reality is going to set in, somebody's going to have to declare victory and say, "Okay, now back to work."
Well, the doctor will say, your chicken pox is gone. And my brave action in cutting off your leg was what did it. That's what happened.
Right. So that was my question. Let's say that it's all clear 3 months from now. In the climate in the UK, do you see any room for any serious debate after the fact over whether this was all an overreaction in the middle of the panic?
We might have one of our famous inquiries, like the one into the Iraq War, which take about 100 years. And then far from clear in their results. I wouldn't place much hope in that. I think I'm probably going to come off badly out of this. I still feel I have to do it, but I don't think I don't think I'm going to be awarded a medal for civil courage or anything, because I think the general view will be that the government's action was timely and successful and justified. Right. Amongst other things, I think civil society will be a lot weaker afterwards as well. One of the effects of this, if you don't use the power that you have to protest against things, if you don't fulfill your role in civil society, then it seems to me you lose it, just as your muscles atrophy when you don't use them. And I think that it will be weaker, and for other reasons, I think probably pretty obvious to any thinking mind. I think the newspapers in particular are likely to be much weaker after this is over than they were before.
And well, that leads to the thing we began with, the erosion of civil liberty or the right to free expression. In this whole modeling approach to the coronavirus emergency is a fast-forwarded version of the climate change arguments. Right, we're destroying the planet. We've got politicians over here saying climate change is an emergency, and if you have granted the government emergency powers in emergency A, why shouldn't they retain them if we're still in emergency B?
I think there's a lot in that, and also once you've got an emergency or the ability to call one is made much easier, which I think it is now, and it will be used more. My great fear has been for a long time that the Western world will get itself embroiled in a new war in the Middle East, quite possibly also affecting Russia, so that we take the side of Saudi Arabia against Iran in a conflict which goes hot. And under those circumstances, of course, states of emergency and lockdowns and mass house arrests and all the rest of it will become a much greater feature of our lives. I've been living for some time in a feeling of growing darkness. I said some years ago, and I keep saying that we live in a pre-war rather than a post-war world. And I think this will make the narrowing of society, the suppression of dissent, and the general destruction and squeezing of liberty and dissent which take place during wartime will make them easier, because after all, what did we do when we were told, for goodness sake, we sing songs. They rule Britannia. Britannia rule the ways. Britons never, never, never will be slaves. And some jack in office tells us one night on TV we can't leave our houses. And what do? We obey. Well, so much for that. All the national songs are going to have to be rewritten now because we're a nation of obedient serfs, it seems to me. It's shameful. I'm ashamed of my own country on the face of the globe. For there might be, of course, as this goes on, as the weather grows warmer and the evenings longer, there might be trouble in enforcing it, but it won't be with the middle classes, who will be, I think, continue to be obedient right up to the last minute.
So in your book, The Abolition of Britain, you contrasted basically the watershed change in Britain at the funeral or the death of Princess Diana. Right? Do you regard this as big a moment as that?
It's very similar, except that I think the numbers of people who were at the time of the Diana frenzy, the numbers of people who were whispering over their back garden fences, this has nothing to do with me. I'm sorry that this beautiful young woman has died, but I really and truly, I don't feel the way that these crowds I see on the television are feeling. There were many more of them then than there are now. Right. People saying this is wrong. An opinion poll at the weekend actually claimed that 96% of the population were in support of the government's actions, sort of Saddam Hussein type figure. Such support, as we know, is often very broad, but very shallow, and may dissipate. But nonetheless, it is a sign of how things are that such a poll could even be remotely right. Even in this shutdown, I had people twice. I was in the centre of Oxford this morning doing some shopping. I had two people call to me across the distance of at least 7 feet, I have to say, to avoid any suspicion that I might have been breaking the rules, that they were very pleased that I'd raised this issue. So maybe there is opposition, but I don't think it's particularly strong.
So I had another question. I'm able to watch some of the trolls attack you on Twitter, and I've seen a number of those chains. When you write your columns, or when you take the stand that you've taken, a lonely voice in Britain, I see the hostile reaction that you get from the trolls and from the mob. Do you get any kind of official pressure?
No. Are you? No, nothing of that kind. Absolutely not.
So you're still free to write and say.
If anybody tried that on me, I promise you that I would go straight into print about it as well. But no, I don't think that's the character. One has to wonder whether some of these attacks are in some way organized by somebody, because one always does on the internet. But I don't know who would organize it. No, I think I don't think that is the problem. They don't need that. Given if you have a huge conformist electronic mob ready to chase people for dissenting, they don't mind really. They don't care all that much what I say. They're not interested in what I say. Generally they don't read it. They're not, in most cases, very good at reading. And what they do know is that they hate me for dissent. And I wrote a piece for a magazine called First Things a few weeks ago, in which I pointed out that in an uncivilized society, people like me get clubbed to death very early on. But in civilized societies, we grow to manhood and continue to trouble people until we die. There are just some of us who are naturally inclined, not necessarily to believe what we're told, not to join in. And we are, in my view, essential to any civilized society, even though you don't like us. But the response is not, I disagree with you, this is why. The response is, I wish you were dead. And if I thought I could get away with it, I and my friends would come around and club you to death. The days in which dissent is going to be possible are, I think, fading from us. It's still possible, and it will be for a while, but not forever.
Are the churches shut down?
The archbishops of the Church of England agreed to it, and I think the other churches as well. You can't get into churches mostly. I don't think they're locked. There are no services. People have these, to me, rather pitiful online attempts at services, but it's not the thing. Once you've accepted the argument, that by being confined to your house you're saving lives, then it's very, very difficult, isn't it, to say, well, in that case, I'll go to church and kill people.
Right. The one of the things that's happened, and we're having this battle/discussion here, at least 3 of the states, Michigan, Florida, and Texas, that shut down, declared that churches remain an essential service. So some of the states that have shut down churches as well, but other states have said that gathering together for worship remains an essential an essential service.
Well, I can only be glad that you have, to that extent, the continued existence of some states' rights where this policy can vary. But it does seem to me the pressure will be on those states which have permitted worship to continue. As this goes on, I think more and more the voice will say, look at these deaths. Why are you continuing to risk further deaths by having church services? As long as the argument is accepted that shutdowns save lives, it's very difficult to maintain anything other than obedience to it. That's why I challenge the whole thing. I say, are we sure that this is actually saving lives at all? Because there is no other way in which it can be challenged, or in my view, ever brought to a permanent end.
Do you, a slight change of emphasis or leaning, do you believe China?
Well, no, I don't think I do. I spent a lot of time in the first decade of this century traveling around China, and it's a fascinating and exhilarating and terrifying place. But what it is beyond doubt is a secret police despotism, and under the current president Xi, it's much worse than it was before. And Hitchens' first law of statistics is all politically important statistics are fiddled. And that's true of free countries. So how it would be like to be less true of unfree countries, such as the People's Republic, I don't know. I would be disinclined to take as gospel anything the Chinese government said to me about anything.
So, and what that tells us, we don't know what the denominator is. What sort of figures are we? You mentioned the Oxford study that talked about possible large amount of herd immunity in the UK already.
Yes, and in general, it was more. It didn't argue for the kind of actions which the Imperial group were arguing for. It's been widely attacked, of course, because it dissented from the consensus. But whether those attacks are motivated by a pursuit of scientific truth or for other reasons, one can only speculate.
But this whole thing seems to me like a story problem in 6th grade, where a student is told a man is in a car in Cody, Wyoming. He's driving east at 60 miles an hour. How long has he been on the road? Well, you'd say, I don't know, because I don't know. You've not given me the information that I need to solve this problem.
I think we're all in that fix. I would, if various things could be established to my satisfaction, then I would obviously have to drop my opposition to this, but they haven't been so far. And there's the great confusing outlier of what's going on in Italy, about which I think we still need to know a great deal more before we can draw any conclusions about it. But even then, the levels of deaths recorded in Italy are nothing like the sort of hecatombs suggested by the Imperial College study.
Right. And then you've got we're leaving variables out, like what kind of healthcare system is in place. How old is the average
Well, the average
patient?
age of the Italian population is very interesting. And in fact, until recently, what most people would say about Italy was it had been fantastically and very creditably successful in prolonging the lives of the old. And part of the reason for the very high average age is because of that. And that's to its credit. The other thing, very much to its credit, is that old people continue to live with their extended families in a way which in most European countries they don't. But that, of course, also means that if there is any virus spreading, then the young who carry it and don't suffer from it are more likely to infect the old because they live with them. So that's another thing. There's also the fact that northern Italy is probably the most polluted industrial area on the Eurasian landmass outside China. So it has a very high level of pollution damage to people's respiratory systems, and also
and a large number of Chinese workers
that
in
I
northern
haven't
Italy.
seen proved. I've heard it suggested, but I haven't seen it proved. But also a very high level of smoking still, which again is another great danger to respiratory systems and producer of lung and heart disease, which are the great killers in normal circumstances. So one just does not know. The other thing is comparisons. It's quite hard to get figures for instance, the levels of influenza epidemics in Italy before and how badly these affected the old to make comparison, whether it was similar or whether this is utterly and entirely different. I don't know these things. I just think questions need to be asked about whether this is as exceptional as it's being made out to be.
So we live in an era where feelings rule. Right?
Yeah.
So there've been mass panics before, but when we've had mass panics before, it's occurred in a population where the people still believed that there was such a thing as objective truth, independent of how I feel. But we've had a whole generation steeped in the idea that the way you feel, that's all there is. Do you think that has fed the panic at all?
I'm not sure I go that. What certainly does seem to me to be the case is that the old hard Karl Popper idea of scientific method, of experiment and falsifiability, and of the really rigorous standards of science, which basically insist that if it's not actually predictive, then at least it must be easily replicated and, as I say, to be subject to experiment and be falsifiable, has been replaced by a worship of scientists rather than of science, and an increasing acceptance of the idea that scientific knowledge is compatible with consensus and majority. So if you can manage to get a group of scientists who capture the consensus and who appear to be in the majority, then that's all you need to do. You don't need to do the tough experiments. You don't need to have the falsifiability that you used to have to do. Science itself has altered, and the understanding of science in the public has altered, in my view, for the worse. So you also get you get disciplines, hard disciplines like neurology, replaced by neuroscience, which mixes up neurology with soft pseudosciences like psychology, and it's actually there's a retreat, I think, from scientific rigor. Whether this is because of what you said, a preference for feeling over reason, I don't know, but it certainly is the case, and in many of these debates, it's what you find when you argue it. It's very strong in the man-made global warming debate that you're told over and over again that the overwhelming majority or the consensus says this of science. You say, well, that's not necessarily the point, but it is the point for most people. And that's
but if you follow Karl Popper's rigorous method, scientific consensus is an oxymoron.
Well, exactly, yes. But it is, and I say this often, but the thing is that Karl Popper has gone way out of style.
Yes, and so consequently, we have a fusion of feel-good pop psychology and scientific-looking graphs and models and things decked out like a scientist might have produced it.
Yeah,
they've still got the white lab coats, and they've still got the credibility that was earned by the old school scientists.
Yes.
Who were willing for their theories to be wrong.
What they're doing is they're arguing from authority. I am a scientist, you will obey. And it's almost papal in a way that popes aren't these days.
Yeah. Given the current pope, it's way beyond papal.
Indeed.
Yeah. So I can't. As we've had these debates and discussions, as I've said things online, one of the steady drumbeat responses that I've heard is I'd rather listen to experts than to podunk pastors like you or people like you you're just popping off. You're just a journalist. I'd rather trust the experts. But what you're actually trusting are the experts who are allowed near the microphones.
Well, that is true. How are experts selected? And it also, does expertise actually free us from any demand that we make a judgment of our own? It's worth looking up, and it's on the Peter Hitchens blog. It's worth looking up the full text of Lord Sumption's interview on this, in which this matter arose. And he said, we shouldn't allow ourselves to be imprisoned by scientists if we feel that common sense and reason in any way undermines what they say. Expertise has to be respected, of course it does. But as I said earlier on, there are differing views among experts. The more expert someone is, the more likely he is to disagree with another expert in the same field, in my experience. Right. So it doesn't free you from the responsibility of choice. And and I say it again, all these people in politics have sought, often by enormous expenditure of effort and money and ambition and gouging their way forward with their elbows, they've sought office so that they could be in a position to make these judgments. So they have to make them themselves. And if two experts conflict, they have to decide which of them they accept, or to reject both of them if they wish to. That's what they're there for. If they didn't want to do that, they shouldn't have become what they are.
Right. And so if they, and once they've picked their expert, they've picked the horse they're going to bet on, because we're a society ill-equipped for an honest debate over the issues, the expert that you didn't pick has to be sort of ignored out of existence.
Yeah. And if people speak up against your chosen expert, they have to be crushed.
Right.
And of course, the classic political example of this, which has been written about recently by my good friend Peter Pringle, is the case of Trofim Lysenko, the Soviet scientist who became Stalin's favorite and whose rivals, who were much better scientists, were destroyed by him, particularly Vavilov. And it is a classic example of how how should I put this? The worship of scientific expertise can get you up a gum tree if you aren't very careful who you worship. I mean, Lysenko's work is now obviously rubbish, but at the time he seemed to be credible.
Right. Well, on those immortal words, get you up a gum tree. I think we'll bring this in for landing. Peter, thank you very much for spending this time with us. Our morning, your evening. I hope we didn't.
Night is coming on here.
Yeah, I hope we didn't keep you up past your bedtime.
No, not quite.
All
Good
right.
night, adults everywhere, as I say at the end of my Twitter cast.
Good night.
If
God bless.
Still any.
All right. Stay 7 feet away from everybody. Yeah.
And our love to you too.